Welcome to Dungeon Academics. My name is Thomas and I will be your instructor. I've been inspired to make this video after watching a video by another creator called Save vs BS, and they were talking about a game called Runehammer and a concept in gaming, well, a concept in general called cognitive load. It's a really good video. I'll link it in the description. I thoroughly recommend you check it out. To be brief, cognitive load is just the amount of work your brain has to put in to do a task or series of tasks. And in general, it's seen as a bad thing. Like, more cognitive load is bad, less cognitive load is good. I have a slightly more nuanced view than this, and in fact, it's helped me revise a philosophy that I've had about gaming for a long time. And I love this. If I see something that's good enough to change my mind on an opinion, that's a cause for celebration, because I love being persuaded to change my mind, because that means I have a better opinion on something afterwards, which is always nice to have. So, very quickly, let's take a look at this. And I'm going to be using some graphics, so you're not going to be looking at my face the whole video. Here is what we think of as cognitive load. You have a situation where you have a game that has a good level of complexity in the rules. And there are games that are more complex and there are games that are more simple. And you want something in the middle relative to your personal choices. We'll call this ideal gameplay. Now, of course, there are some games that are a bit more complex than that, but you still enjoy. And there are some games that are a bit simpler than that, and you still enjoy them. So we also have a slightly larger envelope that we call acceptable gameplay. And anything that lies beyond this envelope is not fun to play. Either it's too complex and that makes the game too stressful, because you're just having to concentrate and think more than you want to. Instead of being a game, it feels like punishment or unnecessarily complex maths homework. On the other hand, if a game is too simple, I find it unengaging. I need a certain level of complexity in the gameplay to engage my brain. And if it's too simple, I end up not being able to focus on the game to the level that I should. If we are playing a game and in the background, my mind is thinking about other things, trying to solve maths problems, maybe I'm playing a game of Catan online on my phone, it's a sign that the game is too simple for me. And here's the really important thing. This threshold, this envelope is different for every person. I understand that I am potentially a bit weird compared to most people, and I like things that are more complex, that keep my brain engaged. And that there are some levels of complexity which are perfectly acceptable for most people that are just not firing enough neurons in my brain to keep me happy. This isn't me trying to brag and say I'm smarter and I think faster than everyone else. I understand that I am relatively smart and I think relatively quickly. It's just the way I work. I appreciate a level of complexity that not everyone seems to. And that's okay, because everyone is different. That envelope of acceptable gameplay is going to be in a different place for everyone. And what we want is we want games that sit somewhere in everyone's envelope. So for some people, it's going to be in the more complex end. In other people, it's going to be in the simpler end. But as long as it's within everyone's envelope, we're happy. Now, the way I've thought about this previously is with a graph with an XY axis. And we have complexity or cognitive load on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and agency on the vertical axis. Agency tells us how much choice we get to make in the game, how many different strategies or approaches we can use and still have engaging gameplay. If the gameplay is too linear, there's not enough choices, it can be not as fun. And in general, adding more agency tends to be more fun, because if there are more options, you don't necessarily have to take all of them. Now, I've envisaged a typical linear relationship between them. Now, this linear relationship doesn't hold true for all games, but in general, if you increase the complexity and therefore the cognitive load required to play the game, you tend to increase the amount of player agency there is. The more rule mechanics there are, the more ways there are to interact with those rule mechanics. Now, this relationship doesn't hold true for all games. There are games that fall under this line. The cognitive load is too high for the agency that the game has, that the players have in the game, I should say. And I think this makes a bad game. The juice is not worth the squeeze. It is too complex, too stressful to play for the amount of fun gameplay that you have. On the other hand, there are games that have really rich choices and complex gameplay, but without complex mechanics. So they're low on cognitive load, but high on agency. And I've traditionally viewed these as better games. There's more flexibility, more gameplay options without the unnecessary cognitive load. Now, taking into consideration that I now understand the concept of cognitive load, and I know I need a certain level of it to trigger my interest, we can overlap this envelope of cognitive load onto this graph. And all I've done is I've stretched that bubble all the way across the y-axis. So any game that fits within that green bubble in the envelope, that is my preferred level of complexity, the level of cognitive load where I enjoy the game the most. And we have around the outside, on the left and right, a level of acceptable gameplay where it's not ideal, but I'll still enjoy it. And what we want is we want to be as high as possible in this bubble. I want a game that gives me the most agency, the most gameplay, the most choices, while still being complex enough to be interesting, but not too complex to be stressful. So for me, a game is going to fit somewhere in that green bubble, and the higher up it is, the better it is for me. Now, everyone's bubble is going to be in a different place. It might be wider, it might be narrower. And again, we need to find games where the complexity is suitable for everyone at the table. Or if you're making a game, you want to make it so that the complexity bubble is going to cover as many different gamers as possible. So you want a level of complexity that's suitable for the people that want a more complex game, but still playable for the people that want a less complex game. And that's a real challenge. And it does mean there is no true universal roleplay game, because some people just want less cognitive load when they play. They do not want the stress of maths and too many decisions and too many special rules. Whereas other people want that diversity in gameplay. They want 15 different resources to keep track of. And any game that's too simple for them is not going to be engaging. If you can make a game that fits somewhere in the middle and sits in as many people's cognitive bubble as possible, that's the game that's going to be successful. Is there anything that a game designer can do to improve their chances? Well, let's consider this situation. You have made yourself a game. You are happy with this game. You like this game, but you realise it's probably a bit low on the agency level for the cognitive load required for the game to play the game. And you're thinking, maybe I should cut something out. Maybe I should streamline the game to make it easier. The problem with this is if you streamline the game, you risk reducing player agency. Now, if you can streamline the game without reducing player agency, of course you should do it. But if you make the game simpler to play, there is always the chance that some player agency will be lost in the process. And that can leave you still under the line in the zone you don't want to be in. This, I don't want to say the bad game zone, but the overly complex, the cognitive heavy zone. What can a game designer do to fix this? Something that I've talked about quite a lot in videos is player aids. When you have good player aids, you effectively reduce the cognitive load of playing the game. The game tracks itself, or makes itself easier to track. All the resources that you have to manage become more manageable. The plethora of choices instead becomes a cornucopia of choices. It's not too many, it's now a well-ordered set of choices that become easier to manage. Good player aids can reduce the cognitive load of a game without reducing its complexity. And that's why I haven't just moved that bubble to the left, because you've reduced cognitive load without reducing complexity. Now, if we look at the cognitive load bubble again, in this example, we have a game with a very high cognitive load, but also very high agency. Adding player aids makes the game easier to play. It makes it less stressful to play, and it moves that game solidly into the green zone. What this means is that this game has got a huge degree of agency and choice. Players will enjoy the gameplay, but it is now easier for them to play. So the cognitive load has been reduced, and now the game sits in that ideal zone. If we take another example, here we have a game that is less complex and maybe has less player agency. And the player aids, again, have reduced the stress of the game. But they haven't reduced the complexity, just the felt complexity. And what this means is that even though the player aids have taken that ball to the left, outside of the green zone, it hasn't reduced the actual complexity. So even though the game is easier to play, the brain is still being satisfied by the curious itch to understand and think and plan. So that's why I don't just move the ball to the left. I include this sort of bubble, because it can make the game easier to play, but it doesn't reduce the richness of the gameplay. And so, even though the ball looks like it's been moved out of my green zone by the player aids, it effectively still is in there. This gives you the best of both worlds. It can make a complex game simpler, allowing more people to enjoy it without feeling stressed. But it still has that level of complexity that people who want more complex games are looking for. I have felt this exact phenomena in board games. I've been playing a board game and I've realised without these player aids, this game would be too complicated to play. And I really appreciate the good design work that's gone into making this playable. And then I've played other games that were really, really easy to play. And I've thought this is quite simple, but then I've looked at what the player aids are doing, and I've realised they are disguising a layer of complexity that I really appreciate as a game player. And that even though the game could be perceived to be quite easy, the level of complexity is there, but it's hidden. And I find that very engaging. So even though this would otherwise have been moved out of my preferred cognitive load bubble, it still sits in there because I can see the level of thought that's gone into the player aids, and I see the complexity behind the player aids, and that makes the game more engaging for me. So what does this all mean for me as an aspiring game designer, and for you as someone who enjoys games? I think it's worth thinking about the level of cognitive load that your game has, either the game that you're playing or the game that you're designing. How complex does it need to be for the game part of roleplay game to be rewarding and engaging? If the game part is too complicated, too stressful, it's hard work. But on the other hand, if the game part is too easy, it's unrewarding and unengaging. A role-play game is a game, and gameplay elements are really, really important. Without them, it's just a cooperative storytelling exercise. And let's be clear on this, those are still fun, but it's not a role-play game. A role-play game has mechanics for success, failure, opportunity. The mechanics give the players choices they can make, and in those choices, the gameplay comes through. How complex those mechanics are, that all depends on what kind of game you're trying to make. And it's worth remembering that everyone has a different preference for cognitive load. Reducing cognitive load is not always ideal. The gameplay element does require an element of thought to be put in by the players and the games master. You just need to find a game that sits comfortably in everyone's cognitive bubble. And with good player aids, that becomes a lot easier. Really do check out that video on Save versus BS. I thought it was great, definitely worth a watch. So thank you for coming with me, and enjoy your next game, whatever it may be.